They came, expecting conquest. What they got was compost. In the grand saga of interstellar domination, no one expected the galaxy's fiercest fleet to be humbled by a farmer with a smile, a thermos of lemonade, and a chicken named ERL. Enhanced recursive life form. But then again, no one ever really understood Terra Prime's most underestimated weapon, ingenuity with a touch of gardening. The farmer's gambit. How Terra Prime's simplest outsmarted the galaxy's finest. Grand Commander Zarvan Thorn stood at the bridge of the Dominion Starfire, his primary tentacles drumming an impatient rhythm against the polished obsidian command console. Behind him, the massive holographic display showed yet another primitive Terra Prime settlement, this one labeled Agricultural Zone 274, North American Continent. 3,000 successful planetary conquests, he announced to his bridge crew, his voice modulator perfectly calibrated to project both authority and boredom. 3,000 worlds, each more advanced than the last, all now productive members of the Cosmic Accord, and now they send us to this farm. Lieutenant Lyra Vox cleared her throat tubes, a sound reminiscent of wind chimes in a hurricane. Sir, Strategic Command believes starting with isolated settlements will minimize resistance during the initial phase of conquest. Zarvan Thorn waved a dismissive tentacle at the display. The hologram zoomed in on a particular property, revealing a modest two-story dwelling surrounded by perfectly arranged rows of vegetation. A single human male moved between the rows, performing what appeared to be maintenance tasks with remarkably primitive tools. Target identified, announced the ship's AI. Elias Grange, age 42, occupation, agricultural specialist, no military training, no advanced weapon systems detected, threat level negligible. Negligible. Zagzalon 9 laughed, his epidermis shifting to a shade of amused purple. I would say non-existent. Look at him. He's practicing agriculture like our ancestors did 50,000 years ago. Manual labor exposed to the elements, using metal tools instead of molecular reconstructors. The bridge crew shared knowing looks. They had seen this before, their commander's trademark confidence before a conquest. It was this very confidence that had earned him the title, the Inevitable, across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Sir, Lyra Vox ventured. Preliminary scans indicate some unusual energy signatures from the property. Probably their primitive electrical grid, Zarvan Thorn dismissed. Add it to the report. Speaking of which, prepare my preliminary conquest assessment for High Command. His tentacles danced across the console, dictating target world, Terra Prime. Initial assessment, pre-space flight civilization with minimal defensive capabilities. Recommended approach, standard conquest pattern Delta. Special notes, population appears to be operating at approximately technology level 3, with some sectors barely achieving level 4. Anticipate complete planetary submission within 47 standard hours. The human below continued his methodical work, completely unaware of the vast warship hovering 30,000 meters above his property, cloaked from all Terra Prime detection systems. Elias Grange wiped his brow with a cloth, checked something on a handheld device that made Zarvan Thorn snort with derision, and walked toward a large red structure. Sir, one of the sensor operators called out, we're detecting some unusual mineral compositions in that storage facility. Log it with the other irrelevant details, Zarvan Thorn commanded. Now, let's begin our standard pre-invasion protocol. I want psychological warfare packages prepared for deployment within the hour. Lieutenant Lyra Vox, you'll oversee the initial Cobra Intact team. Remember, we need only one human specimen to demonstrate our superiority to their planetary leadership. As the bridge crew scrambled to execute his orders, Zarvan Thorn took one final look at the human below. The farmer had stopped to pet some kind of quadrupedal creature, completely oblivious to his role in the coming conquest of his world. To think, Zarvan Thorn mused, his skin rippling with patterns of confidence and amusement. That high command actually suggested, "I bring the full invasion fleet for this operation. One ship will be more than sufficient for these primitives. After all, what could a single human farmer possibly do against the most advanced military force in the known galaxy?" The question hung in the recycled air of the bridge. Meant to be rhetorical, none of the crew dared suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, they should pay more attention to those unusual energy readings, or wonder why this particular farm had been specifically marked for their first contact. That would be their first mistake of many to come. The war room aboard the Dominion Starfire gleamed with holographic displays, each one showing different angles of Elias Grange's farm. Around the central planning table, various alien specialists gathered, their appendages and sensory organs all focused on the data streams flowing through the air. As you can see, Professor Sierra Quen began, her color-shifting scales displaying academic confidence. These humans operate on a seasonal agricultural cycle. Most fascinating, really. They actually wait for plants to grow, instead of using quantum acceleration chambers. Zarvan Thorn raised his primary tentacle, silencing the enthusiastic xenoanthropologist. "Professor, we're not here to study their primitive farming techniques. We're here to establish dominance. Lieutenant Lyra Vox, present the invasion strategy." Lyra Vox stepped forward, her ceremonial armor clicking against the polished floor. With a wave of her neural transmitter, the holographic display zoomed in on the farm's layout. "We've identified 4 primary structures. The residential unit, this larger storage facility they call a barn, and 2 smaller outbuildings. Our initial psychological warfare package will target the residential structure." Admiral Commander Varn, who had survived 300 planetary conquests, leaned forward on his gravity chair. Why not simply vaporize the entire property? It would be more efficient. "Because," Admiral Zarvan Thorn said with exaggerated patience, "High Command wants us to demonstrate our superiority, not merely obliterate them. We need this human to acknowledge our power. It's about psychological impact." The tactical officer, Junior Commander Tactician Nix, brought up a new display showing a detailed timeline. Phase 1. We deploy our standard fear inducements, temporal distortions, gravity fluctuations, the usual package. Phase 2. We demonstrate our technological superiority by selectively phasing the bare primitive tools in and out of reality. Phase 3. Direct contact and capture. "Seems excessive for one human farmer," Admiral Commander Varn muttered, his armored plates rustling with skepticism. Oh, Zarvan Thorn's skin rippled with patterns of amused condescension. Would the Admiral prefer to sit this one out? "Perhaps these primitives are too challenging for your expertise." The war room filled with the alien equivalent of nervous chuckling. Admiral Commander Varn's plates flushed a deep shade of embarrassment. "I've taken the liberty," Lyra Vox continued diplomatically, "of analyzing their defensive capabilities." The hologram shifted to show Morgan's farm equipment. As you can see, their most advanced technology appears to be this tractor device. It runs on refined hydrocarbons, if you can believe it. Professor Sierra Quen couldn't contain herself. "Actually, that's not entirely—" "Thank you, Professor," Zarvan Thorn interrupted. "We can discuss their charming primitive ways after the conquest. Now regarding containment protocols." The meeting continued, with each specialist adding unnecessarily complex layers to what should have been a simple capture operation. No one wanted to suggest a simpler approach, not with the Grand Commander's reputation for elaborate conquest strategies. And finally, Lyrivox concluded an hour later, "We'll need to decide on the format for their surrender documentation. Traditional quantum inscription, or should we downgrade to something their primitive systems can process?" Zarvan Thorn waved all his tentacles dismissively. "Prepare both, though I doubt this Elias Grange can even comprehend our standard surrender protocols. Have we determined why this particular human was chosen as our first contact?" The room fell silent. Finally, Professor Syra Quen spoke up. "The selection came directly from High Command, sir. They were quite specific about this location. Probably random chance," Zarvan Thorn decided. "After all, one primitive farm is much like another. Now, are there any final concerns before we begin the operation?" Admiral Commander Varn shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, those energy readings the sensors picked up. Already addressed in the plan, Admiral. Section 47, subsection Gamma. Do try to keep up." Zarvan Thorn's skin displayed patterns of supreme confidence mixed with mild irritation. "Any other concerns?" "No. Excellent. Begin deployment of Phase 1 assets. I want temporal distortion fields in place within the hour." As the assembled officers filed out of the war room, Professor Syra Quen lingered behind, studying the holographic display of Morgan's farm with unusual intensity. "Something fascinating about their primitive agriculture?" Professor Zarvan Thorn asked sardonically. "Oh no, sir," she replied, her scales shifting to a thoughtful pattern. "I was just wondering why a simple farmer would need quantum shielding around his barn." "Clearly a malfunction in the sensors," Zarvan Thorn declared. "Update your equipment, Professor. We can't have faulty readings disrupting our perfect record of conquest." As the door sealed behind the departing professor, Zarvan Thorn allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Soon another world would join the hegemony, and his legend would grow even greater. After all, how much trouble could one human farmer cause? The Dominion Starfire's AI chose that moment to update the threat assessment from negligible to unknown, but it had been programmed never to contradict its commander's confidence. Initiating temporal distortion field in 3, 2, 1, Lieutenant Lyrivox's voice rang through the command center as the Dominion Starfire deployed its most reliable psychological warfare tactic. Below, the evening sky above Elias Grange's farm rippled like water in a disturbed pond. "Excellent," Zarvan Thorn purred, his skin glowing with anticipation. "Cue the gravity fluctuations and begin recording. I want to document the human's inevitable panic." On the massive view screen, Elias Grange stepped out of his house, looked up at the distorted sky, and yawned. He checked his watch, pulled out a small device that looked suspiciously like a remote control, and pressed a button. Suddenly, the temporal distortion field collapsed. "Impossible!" screeched the technical officer, all 6 appendages flying across the control panel. "The field generator it's been nullified." Zarvan Thorn's skin shifted to a dangerous shade of crimson. "Deploy the backup field. Start the gravity fluctuations now." Elias Grange stretched, walked to his rocking chair on the porch, and sat down. When the second temporal field flickered into existence, he pulled out his device again and pressed another button. The field disappeared, as if it had never existed. "Perhaps," Admiral Commander Varn suggested dryly, "we should try actually talking to him." "Fine," Zarvan Thorn snapped. "Prepare the diplomatic contact unit. Full intimidation protocol." And 10 minutes later, A sleek shuttle descended from the Dominion Starfire, landing in Morgan's front yard with theatrical precision. The diplomatic team emerged, 3 tall, imposing aliens in ceremonial armor, each one carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Elias Grange stood up from his rocking chair. "Evening," he called out, as if greeting neighbors who'd dropped by for coffee. "Mind not landing on my tomatoes next time." The diplomatic team faltered. This wasn't in the standard conquest protocol. The lead diplomat, recovering quickly, activated his universal translator. "Human, you stand in the presence of the cosmic accord. Prepare for—" "Could you turn down the volume a bit?" Morgan interrupted, cleaning his ear with his pinky finger. "Some of us have sensitive hearing." The diplomat's scales turned a confused shade of mauve. He adjusted his translator. "You will surrender immediately and—" "Yeah, about that." Morgan scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I'm kind of busy right now. Crop rotation season. You know how it is. Maybe come back next week." Zarvan Thorne, watching from orbit, felt his primary cardiac organ skip a beat. "Deploy the capture team now." A second shuttle swooped down, disgorging 20 elite shock troops, their quantum armor gleaming in the setting sun. They surrounded Morgan in a textbook containment pattern, weapons charged. "Last chance for peaceful surrender, human," the lead trooper announced. Morgan sighed, pulled out his remote again, and pressed a third button. The ground beneath the shock troops suddenly became frictionless. 20 of the galaxy's most elite soldiers went sliding across the yard like children on an ice rink, crashing into each other with decidedly undignified yelps and squeals. "Anti-gravity-tilled soil," Morgan explained cheerfully. "Great for the root vegetables." "Enough," Zarvan Thorne's voice boomed from the shuttle's speakers. "Seize him!" The diplomatic team charged forward, only to bounce off an invisible barrier 3 feet from the porch. "Force field," Morgan said apologetically. "Can't be too careful these days. Space pirates and all that." In orbit, Zarvan Thorne's skin had turned a shade of purple, previously unknown to xenobiologists. "Deploy the neural disruptors, the paralysis beams, the molecular destabilizers, everything." A dazzling array of energy weapons fired from the shuttles, each one capable of subduing an entire army. Morgan calmly pressed a series of buttons on his remote. Each beam either dissipated harmlessly or reflected back at the shuttles, forcing them to take evasive action. "Got most of this stuff at the Galactic Defense Surplus store," Morgan explained, holding up his remote. "They have great deals if you know when to shop. Black Friday sales and all." The diplomatic team had retreated to their shuttle. The shock troops were still trying to stand up on the frictionless soil, and Elias Grange was pulling a thermos out of his overall armor. "Anyone want some coffee?" he offered. "Might help us all calm down a bit." Back on the Dominion Starfire, Admiral Commander Varn turned to the increasingly agitated Grand Commander. "Sir, perhaps we should consult the historical records about why High Command specifically chose this target." "No." Zarvan Thorne's skin was cycling through colors faster than a malfunctioning disco ball. "This is clearly a fluke, some sort of primitive luck. Prepare the main weapon systems." "Sir," Lyravox interjected, "firing capital ship weapons at a single farm might be seen as excessive." Below, Morgan had set up a small card table on his porch and was dealing what appeared to be playing cards to the few shock troops brave enough to accept his invitation to talk things out like civilized folks. "Should I log this as a successful first contact?" Sir Lyravox asked carefully. "Or perhaps as a temporary tactical withdrawal?" Zarvan Thorne's answer was a string of untranslatable noises that caused the ship's AI to activate its diplomatic censorship protocols. and Elias Grange, terror of the galaxy's most feared conquest force, simply rocked in his chair and smiled up at the evening sky. "Gonna be an interesting week," he muttered to himself, taking another sip of coffee. Dawn broke over Elias Grange's farm, revealing the aftermath of 17 failed capture attempts. The field behind his barn now resembled a scrapyard of disabled alien technology hover tanks, trapped in what appeared to be ordinary mud, but was actually molecular adhesive, stealth units hanging upside down from what the aliens had dismissed as primitive irrigation systems, and a dozen elite infiltration troops who'd been caught in what Morgan called his scarecrow defense grid. In orbit, the Dominion Starfire's war room had descended into barely controlled chaos. "Report," Zarvan Thorn demanded, his skin cycling through shades of frustration previously unknown to chromatic science. Lieutenant Lyra Vox cleared her throat tubes nervously. The quantum tunneling team was defeated by, I can't believe I'm saying this, by a sprinkler system. A sprinkler system. Admiral Kex-12's armor plates rattled with disbelief, filled with something he calls sweet tea. Lyra Vox continued. It completely disrupted their phase synchronization. They materialized inside his cornfield, where the plants apparently have some sort of security programming. On the main screen, several highly trained quantum commandos could be seen running in terror from a group of corn stalks that moved with decidedly predatory intent. "The Sonic Disruptor Squadron," Agalon 9 asked through clenched sensory appendages, neutralized by what appears to be a modified wind chime array. "They're currently dancing." The display shifted to show 3 squads of elite troops performing what looked suspiciously like the chicken dance around Morgan's barn. "And our psychic warfare specialists." Lyra Vox shifted uncomfortably. They made mental contact with something the human calls ERL, Enhanced Recursive Life Form, in his barn. They're now requesting immediate retirement and recommending we classify this entire sector as absolutely not worth it. On the surface, Morgan sat in his rocking chair, sipping coffee and making notes in a small notebook. "Let's see. That makes 37 disabled hover tanks, 12 scrambled stealth units, and about 200 soldiers who will need directions back to their ship once the corn maze lets them go." A massive shadow fell over the farm as the Dominion Starfire descended through the clouds, its intimidation protocols at maximum. "Elias Grange," Zarvan Thorn's voice boomed from the ship's external speakers. "You have forced us to take extreme measures." Morgan looked up, squinting. "Might want to adjust your stabilizers there. You're listing about 3 degrees to port." The massive warship corrected its position almost reflexively before Zarvan Thorn realized he'd just taken flight advice from his target. "Deploy the nanite swarms," he screamed, causing several bridge officers to adjust their audio dampeners. Clouds of microscopic robots descended on the farm, only to be met by what appeared to be ordinary fireflies. The resulting light show was spectacular, if brief. Morgan's bioengineered insects made short work of the military-grade nanites. "Those are nice," Morgan commented, pointing at a squadron of combat mechs dropping from the ship's launch bays. "Second-generation Devastator units, right? Mind the pig pen with those. BX-31 gets upset about uninvited guests." The mech pilots had just enough time to wonder why anyone would name a pig BX-31 before said pig, which was decidedly larger and more cybernetically enhanced than any pig, had a right to be demonstrated exactly why the farm's defensive perimeter didn't have any gaps on that side. "The casualty report, sir?" Lyra Vox asked, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she watched BX-31 chase 1,000,000 credits worth of military hardware across the field. Zarvan Thorn had begun stress molting, a condition rarely seen in his species. Just tell me we still have troops capable of fighting." "Define capable," Admiral Kex 12 muttered, watching as another squad discovered the hard way that Morgan's scarecrows had been upgraded with surplus military-grade defense systems. "The water tower," Zarvan Thorn suddenly declared. "It's the only structure we haven't targeted. Destroy it. That will show him our—" "I really wouldn't." Morgan's voice came through their command channel, causing several officers to jump in surprise. "That's not actually water in there." A junior tactical officer, eager to prove himself, launched a missile anyway. The resulting explosion did nothing to the tower, but somehow turned every piece of alien technology within 100 yards into what appeared to be lawn ornaments. "Warned you?" Morgan said cheerfully. "Anyone want some lemonade? Real stuff, not the molecular replication kind. Does wonders for stress." Professor Thala III, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Sir, I finished analyzing the property records. You really should see this." "Not now," Zarvan Thorn roared. "Prepare the temporal inversion device. We'll remove his entire farm from the timeline." "Already tried that Tuesday morning." Morgan's voice came through again. "Check your ship's chronometers. You'll find that Tuesday now happens twice this week. Really messes with my planting schedule." In the distance, BX-31 had cornered the remaining mech units against the barn. The pilots were discovering that their emergency teleporters had been redirected to materialize them safely, but pantsless in the middle of Morgan's corn maze. Sir Lyra Vox said with the careful tone of someone addressing an increasingly unhinged superior, "Perhaps we should consider a different approach." Zarvan Thorn's response was to order an orbital bombardment, only to discover that someone and everyone knew exactly who had replaced their plasma torpedo payload with what appeared to be prize-winning tomatoes. "Those are my special variety," Morgan called up helpfully. "Got a blue ribbon at the county fair last year. Feel free to keep them. They're great on sandwiches." As the sun set on another day of failed conquest attempts, Elias Grange added a final note to his ledger. "Remind self. Send thank you note to Galactic Defense Surplus for their excellent post-holiday sales, and maybe apologize to ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform, for the psychic incident." In orbit, Zarvan Thorn began planning his most desperate assault yet, completely missing Professor Thala III's increasingly frantic attempts to share her research findings about exactly who Elias Grange used to be before he decided to become a simple farmer. Professor Thala III stood before the assembled command staff, her scales shifting between academic excitement and nervous anticipation. The holographic displays around her showed thousands of documents she'd retrieved from various galactic databases. "As I've been trying to tell you," she began, glancing at the now twitching Grand Commander, Zarvan Thorn. "Elias Grange isn't exactly what he appears to be." "You mean he's not a primitive farmer who has somehow humiliated the greatest military force in the galaxy?" Admiral Kex 12 asked dryly, nursing a beverage that looked suspiciously like Morgan's lemonade. "Computer, display file, Gamma 7, Thala III commanded. A military service record appeared, causing several officers to gasp. Elias Grange, former head of research and development for the Unified Stellar Command. Zarvan Thorn's skin turned a pale shade of realization. "That's impossible." The GDF's chief scientist disappeared 20 years ago after creating the most advanced defensive systems ever conceived, Thala III finished. Systems that were deemed too powerful to mass produce. He resigned the day before the hegemony tried to seize his research. Lieutenant Yara 6, who had been cross-referencing data, spoke up. "But why become a farmer? Why Terra Prime?" "Because," Professor Sira Quen explained, bringing up more files. What better hiding place than a primitive world? And what better cover than a profession everyone underestimates? Look at his farm layout. The holographic display shifted, showing an overhead view of the property with new analytical overlays. What had appeared to be simple crop rows were revealed as a sophisticated defensive grid. The barn's quantum shielding extended throughout the entire property through a network disguised as irrigation pipes. Even his crops are engineered, Professor Sarah Quinn continued, her voice filled with professional admiration. Those corn stalks, they're partially sentient. The tomatoes? Bioengineered with molecular reconstruction properties. And let's not even get started on BX-31. What about BX-31? Someone asked nervously. Let's just say she's not technically a pig anymore, more like a quantum computer with bacon tendencies. Admiral Kex-12 leaned forward. And ERL, Enhanced Recursive Life Form, the entity that traumatized our psychic warfare team. Professor Sarah Quinn's scales rippled with amusement. As far as I can tell, ERL, Enhanced Recursive Life Form, is either a hyper-intelligent chicken or a dimensional anomaly that really enjoys living in the barn. Possibly both. But the farming, Zarvan Thorn protested weakly. He actually grows things, manually. Yes, Professor Sarah Quinn nodded, because he enjoys it. Don't you see? He took our most advanced technology and adapted it to create the perfect retirement setup. Every primitive tool on that farm is more sophisticated than our best military gear. When on the main screen, Morgan could be seen casually reprogramming one of their captured hover tanks into what appeared to be an automated tomato planter. That doesn't explain the sprinkler system that defeated our quantum tunneling team, Lyravox pointed out. Oh, but it does. Professor Sarah Quinn brought up another file. Sweet Tea has exactly the right molecular structure to disrupt quantum fields when properly energized. He literally weaponized a beverage. The command staff sat in stunned silence, watching as Morgan used their disabled nanite swarms to pollinate his cucumber plants. So, Admiral Kex-12 said finally, we've been attempting to capture the one person in the galaxy who literally wrote the book on defensive warfare, and we've been doing it by attacking his home where he's had 20 years to prepare for exactly this situation. Not exactly, Professor Sarah Quinn corrected. We've been trying to capture someone who improved on all our military technology while making it look like primitive farming equipment. Someone who turned gardening into an art form of tactical warfare. On the screen, Morgan was explaining to several captured alien troops the proper way to stake tomato plants. The soldiers were taking notes. The real question, Professor Sarah Quinn concluded, is why did High Command specifically choose his farm as our first contact point? And why didn't they tell us who he really was? Zarvan Thorn, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly straightened his posture appendages. Because they knew. Sir Lyra Vox asked. They knew we'd underestimate him. Knew we'd see a primitive farmer and act exactly as we did. This wasn't a conquest mission. It was a test, and we failed spectacularly. Below, Morgan had begun teaching some of the stranded alien soldiers how to make proper lemonade. Several of them had already traded their quantum armor for overalls. So, Admiral Kex-12 said, watching as BX-31 herded another group of retreating troops into the corn maze. What do we do now? Professor Sarah Quinn's scales shifted to a color of academic excitement. Well, based on his publication record, Elias Grange was also an expert in geobotany, agricultural terraforming, and sustainable defense systems. We could learn a lot from him if we ask nicely. Zarvan Thorn looked at his increasingly demoralized command staff. then at the farm where the galaxy's most advanced defensive technology was disguised as a rustic paradise. "Lieutenant Lyra Vox," he said finally, "prepare a formal request for farming lessons. This ends today, Grand Commander," Zarvan Thorn declared, his skin pulsing with determination as he addressed his combined fleet. 3 more warships had arrived, surrounding Elias Grange's farm in a display of overwhelming force. "Sir," Lieutenant Lyra Vox ventured, "given what we know about his background, perhaps, precisely because of his background, we must act now." Zarvan Thorn's tentacles danced across the command console before he converts more of our troops into farmers. On the tactical display, another group of allegedly captured soldiers could be seen helping Morgan build what they claimed was a greenhouse, but suspicious looked like a quantum physics laboratory. "All ships, begin simultaneous orbital bombardment. Target everything except the barn. I don't want to risk angering ERL. Enhanced recursive life form again." The sky above Morgan's farm lit up as 4 capital ships opened fire with their main batteries. Energy beams powerful enough to crack planets lanced downward, only to be caught in an elaborate web of defense systems disguised as weather vanes and wind chimes. Morgan stepped out onto his porch, sipping coffee. "Nice light show," he called up to the ships. "Reminds me of the Aurora Borealis. Deploy the ground forces, all of them," Zarvan Thorn commanded, his voice cracking with frustration. Thousands of troops and vehicles descended on the farm. Morgan set down his coffee cup and pulled out a new remote control, this one slightly larger than before. "Last chance, folks," he announced cheerfully. "Anyone interested in learning about sustainable agriculture instead?" Several soldiers immediately dropped their weapons and raised their appendages. "Traitors!" Zarvan Thorn screeched. "Forward! Attack! Attack!" Morgan shrugged and pressed the first button. The innocent-looking scarecrows throughout his field suddenly activated, revealing themselves as reprogrammed combat droids. The second button transformed his entire cornfield into a tactical maze with active defense systems. "BX-31, he called out. "Would you kindly show our guests why we don't trample the vegetable garden?" The cybernetic pig emerged from her pen, now wearing what appeared to be modified battle armor. Several tank commanders immediately surrendered. "The barn," Zarvan Thorn commanded. "Breach the barn. That's his command center." "I really wouldn't," Morgan warned, but the assault troops were already moving. The barn doors opened. Something moved in the darkness. The assault team's psychic screamed. "Higher," Morgan called out casually. "Try not to traumatize them too badly this time." What happened next defied description in any known language, but it involved a lot of feathers and quantum physics. The assault team emerged moments later, babbling about the true nature of reality and requesting immediate transfer to agricultural duties. "You know what your problem is?" Morgan addressed the ships above, as his defensive systems casually dismantled their most sophisticated weapons. "You forgot the basics. Good farming is about patience, observation, and working with nature, not against it. Same goes for defense systems." To demonstrate his point, he pressed another button. Every piece of alien technology on his property suddenly transformed into gardening equipment. Hover tanks became tillers, plasma rifles turned into watering cans, and the quantum displacement field generators started composting leaves. "That's quite impossible," Professor Syra Quen exclaimed, watching the transformation. "The energy requirements alone would—" "Oh, that's just a little trick I learned from studying earthworms," Morgan explained through their command channel. "Amazing what you can do with basic biomechanics and a good understanding of soil chemistry." Zarvan Thorn, Watching his invasion force being systematically converted into a farming cooperative made his final desperate move. Fire the planetary annihilator, full power. The Dominion Starfire's main weapon powered up, its barrel glowing with enough energy to reduce continents to ash. Morgan looked up, sighed, and pressed one final button on his remote. The energy beam fired and turned into a spectacular rainbow that arched perfectly over his property. "How?" Zarvan Thorn whispered, his skin turning the color of total defeat. "Same principle as watering crops," Morgan explained. "It's all about proper dispersal of energy. Speaking of which, you might want to check your engine cores. They're running a bit hot." Before Zarvan Thorn could respond, every ship's propulsion system simultaneously converted itself into what appeared to be an orbital irrigation system. "Now then," Morgan said, pulling out his notebook. "By my count, I've got about 3,000 of your troops who've expressed interest in learning sustainable farming practices. I'm thinking of starting some classes. Could probably use some help from a few science officers, too." Professor Sierra Quen's scales lit up with excitement. The applications for geobotany alone would be revolutionary. This was your plan all along, Admiral Commander Varn realized. Why High Command chose your farm, they didn't want us to conquer Terra Prime. They wanted me to teach you folks a better way, Morgan finished. Galaxy is getting a bit crowded for all this conquest business, don't you think? Now, who wants to learn about crop rotation? Zarvan Thorn looked at his defunct fleet, his converted army, and the farmer who had single-handedly defeated the greatest military force in the galaxy using gardening equipment. "Will there be more lemonade?" he asked finally, his skin shifting to a shade of resignation. "Always," Morgan smiled. "Though we should talk about your sugar intake. Now, about those farming classes." And that's how the most feared invasion force in galactic history found itself enrolled in what would become the universe's most prestigious agricultural academy. Even ERL, Enhanced Recursive Life Form, helped with the quantum physics lectures, though students had to sign a waiver acknowledging that understanding chicken-based dimensional theory might permanently alter their perception of reality. BX-31, to everyone's relief, was put in charge of physical education. 1 month after the failed invasion of Terra Prime, the Dominion Starfire hosted the most unusual treaty signing in galactic history. The ship's formal conference room had been redecorated with potted plants, and the traditional conquest banners had been replaced with agricultural diagrams. "So let me get this straight," the High Commander of the Cosmic Accord said, reviewing the document before him. "Instead of a surrender treaty, you're proposing an educational exchange program." Elias Grange, still wearing his overalls but now sporting a Galaxy's Best Teacher badge made by his alien stunts, nodded. "Seems more productive than conquering planets, doesn't it? Plus, you wouldn't believe how many of your soldiers have a natural talent for organic farming." Through the viewport, dozens of converted warships could be seen in orbit, their weapon systems permanently transformed into sophisticated irrigation equipment. Several now served as orbital greenhouses. "The preliminary results are extraordinary," Professor Sierra Quen reported excitedly. "Crop yields have increased 300% across 17 test worlds. Morgan's methods of combining traditional farming with advanced technology have revolutionized our approach to sustainable agriculture." "And the military applications?" the High Commander asked hopefully. "Well," Morgan scratched his chin, "BX-31 has agreed to teach a course on quantum-enhanced livestock management, though she insists on being addressed as Professor BX-31 now." In the background, Admiral Commander Varn, wearing mud-stained overalls over his ceremonial armor, was enthusiastically explaining companion planting techniques to a group of former shock troops. They had replaced their plasma rifles with garden trowels and seemed much happier for it. "The Galactic Farm and Defense Academy," the High Commander read from the treaty, "with you as the head instructor. Along with ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform, handling the Advanced Physics Department," Morgan confirmed, though we had to add a disclaimer about reality-altering poultry to the curriculum. Zarvan Thorne, his skin now permanently settled into a shade of agricultural enthusiasm, spoke up from his new position as Dean of Sustainable Defense Systems. "The applications are endless. Did you know you can stop a planetary invasion force with properly calibrated tomato plants? Speaking of which," Morgan added, "your forces should start seeing the results of last week's practical exam soon." Right on cue, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Every weapon in the hegemony's arsenal had suddenly sprouted flowers. Warships were automatically converting themselves into agricultural research vessels. Even the feared prison planets were transforming into community gardens. "You planned this from the beginning," the High Commander realized, "when you left the Defense Force 20 years ago." "Sometimes," Morgan said, pouring everyone a glass of his famous lemonade, "the best way to defend the galaxy is to teach it how to grow together instead of fighting. Now, who's ready to learn about honeybee diplomacy?" The treaty was signed amid much laughter and several agricultural puns. The Cosmic Accord, formally transformed from a military force into the galaxy's largest agricultural education institution. Even the feared Dominion Starfire found a new purpose as a traveling farmer's market. As the ceremony concluded, Lieutenant Yara 6, now the head of interstellar crop distribution, approached Morgan. "Sir, there's just one thing we never figured out. What exactly is ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform?" Morgan glanced at the barn where his quantum-enhanced chicken had recently begun teaching advanced physics. "Some questions," he said with a wink, "are best left to grow naturally." In the years that followed, the galaxy entered an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity, marked by abundant harvests and a surprising number of county fairs. Military parades were replaced by harvest festivals, and the only competition between worlds involved prize-winning vegetables. And on a small farm on Terra Prime, Elias Grange continued to teach the art of growing things to students from across the universe, always with a knowing smile and a glass of lemonade ready. BX-31 patrolled the grounds with professional pride, now sporting a proper academic cap between her ears, and ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform, well, ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform, continued to be ERL, Enhanced Recursive Lifeform, though students swore the chicken's physics lectures made slightly more sense after the third glass of lemonade. As Morgan often said while watching his students transform battleships into floating greenhouses, in the end, everything grows according to its nature. Sometimes it just needs a farmer's touch to grow in the right direction.